16 at last, and on my birthday, the 5th of March 1962, I was booked to attend firing school for 2 weeks. This took place at the Orphanage Hut, a wooden structure built on brick piers which was situated along Guildford Park Road, overlooking Guildford Upyard and the coal stage. The building was also used to hold mutual improvement classes for budding drivers and had close links with the Southern Railway Servants' Orphanage at Woking. There were 11 of us cleaners from various depots being taught, and the instructor was John Barrett. The next time that I met John was in 2008 at the Bluebell Railway. I hadn't seen him since that time. I asked John if he kept any record of his instructing days, and he said that he did, and kindly sent me a copy of the dates and times that I was with him. There were 3 from Nine Elms, 2 from Guildford, 1 from Reading, 1 from Basingstoke, 3 from Fratton, and 1 from the Isle of Wight. Here's a photo of some of the Guildford-based firemen from that era who I met at the Bluebell Railway on another occasion. From left to right, you've got Cyril Gardner, Alex McClymont, Terry Owsbury, myself, Alan Mansbridge, Bernie Nibbs, Roger Hope, Ray Bartlett, and Mick Foster. Once you had completed the firing course, and the instructor was satisfied with your progress on completion of the 2 practical exams, you were able to perform firing duties on an as-required basis. I still have the handbook for steam locomotive enginemen that was issued to me, although it's looking a bit dog-eared now. Items within the booklet showed images of good and bad firing technique, and here are some real examples of both. Little and often cold distribution being the order of the day, with correct flow of primary and secondary air through the dampers and firehole door. My first firing turn. I remember that I'd signed on fairly early in the morning, and Fred Price was the running foreman in charge. Fred was a really nice man, and we had got on very well when I'd worked with him as an office boy. He asked Peter Bunce, a past fireman at the time, to help me prepare my locomotive, an N class, and my driver was Ron Heslop. After preparing the loco, we proceeded to Guildford Upyard and worked a freight train up to Woking. I'm not sure that Ron enjoyed having such a rookie fireman with him, as I don't think he'd been passed out as a driver very long himself. Anyway, my first firing turn passed without incident, and I felt quite pleased with how the day had turned out. Quite a lot of our bread and butter work at Guildford would be running a passenger service over the Reading to Red Hill line. The lines were not electrified beyond Aldershot Junction towards Reading and Shelford Junction towards Red Hill, so this meant that the service was hauled by a steam locomotive. I nearly met my end one day at this very spot, 6 and 7 platform, up the gully. I went to uncouple the locomotive from the train, and as I climbed down in between, I landed on the conductor rail protection boards. As soon as my shoes touched the boards, I realised my mistake. Luckily, I hadn't stepped on the conductor rail. A typical day's working after signing on duty would be to relieve and work a train from Guildford to Reading, stopping all stations, and once you'd arrived at Reading Southern Station, the train would be released so that you could run light engine to Reading Southern Depot to prepare your loco for the next trip. This would involve turning the locomotive on the turntable, taking water and sometimes taking on extra coal. The fire would then be prepared, and once completed you would then return to the Southern Station, couple up to the train for the return journey to Guildford and then on to Red Hill. The Guildford to Red Hill line was a fairly arduous route, especially the long climb from Shelford to Gomshall Lane. The gradient then fell to Gomshall and then climbed again to the top of Dorking Bank at Welcombe Bridge. The gradient then fell steeply to Dorking and then to Betchworth before climbing again to Reigate and then falling again to Red Hill. Upon reaching Red Hill, the locomotive was then released and you ran light to Red Hill depot via the Brighton main line, and it was here that the process would again be repeated as described at Reading Southern depot. The fire might also require cleaning, removing any excess clinker, before being prepared again for the return journey to Guildford. The exit from Red Hill depot to the station was fairly easy, via the Tunbridge line, and you would then couple to another train, usually from Tunbridge, and work back to Guildford, calling at all stations, before being relieved by another crew. This whole process would have taken at least 8 hours. It was in a turn such as this that I had my first encounter with a top link driver. The fireman for the turn had gone sick, so the running foreman assigned me the task as I was spare that day. The top link driver on the turn was Reg Howard, and he wasn't exactly pleased that a past cleaner had been chosen for the job, and he made it known to me that he wasn't sure that I was experienced enough and was in two minds whether to take me. The locomotive was U-Class 31639, and she'd only been recently returned to Guildford from shops as the paintwork was new and gleaming. We left the depot with Reg in sombre mood. However, the locomotive performed well, and after a while he became quite jovial. We had a really good trip, and when we returned to the depot, Reg thanked me for the hard work that I put in that day, and said he wouldn't have any problems about taking me out as his fireman again. Locomotive preparation. There were various times allowed for these duties, and this depended on the class of locomotive, although the duties involved were much the same. For preparation, this didn't just involve getting the fire prepared, the coal on the tender trimmed and tender replenished with water. It also involved making sure all the tools and equipment needed were available for the journey. A breakdown of tools and equipment required for each locomotive were as follows: 1 firing shovel, 1 coal pick, 1 baffle plate, 1 rocker bar, only needed for BR standard class or bullied Pacific locomotive with rocking or drop grates, fire irons, 1 dart, 1 pricker and 1 clinker shovel of appropriate length for the firebox, 1 gauge lamp, 1 flare lamp, 4 headlamps with red shades intact, 1 engine oil can, 1 thick oil pot, 1 lubricating oil can, 1 paraffin can, 1 oil feeder, 1 rubber 2-gallon bucket, 1 hand brush, 2 spare gauge glasses and rubber sealing rings, 2 red flags and 12 detonators in date, an assortment of spanners, especially a 3/4 inch spanner which was essential for the opening and closing of the lubricator top nut and the smokebox door retaining lugs, 3 white disc boards for route indications, a storm sheet for locomotives with an open cab when running tender first to aid protection from inclement weather. Towards the end of steam, locomotive tools became fairly scarce, and it was common practice to rob other locomotives of their tools. Eventually it became necessary to remove all the tools from the locomotive and lock them in the stores for the following duty. All the lamps were of the paraffin burning type, so you needed to ensure that they had enough paraffin in them for the duration of the journey. The wicks of the lamps had to be trimmed and adjusted to the right height so that when lit they produced a flame which burnt evenly without smoke being emitted. If this did occur, the smoke could produce a layer of soot on the inside of the lamp, which could eventually eliminate the light. The hydrostatic lubricator sight feeds would be checked and drained if necessary, and the lubricator would be filled with lubricating thick oil. The smoke box door would be checked to ensure it had been closed and fastened properly on disposal. The vacuum pipes would be checked at both ends of the locomotive to ensure they were retained on their dummies with the clips provided. The screw couplings would be checked that they hung correctly on the brackets, and steam heating pipes were held by their securing chains. Once the driver had finished oiling the necessary areas and the trimmings were put in place within their oil boxes, brake tests would be performed, and when completed, the loco would be carefully moved from the shed onto the turntable and placed next to the water column for the final top-up of water before departure. Finally, the fireman would be expected to make a can of tea before setting off to the departure signal. Disposal duties. Normally, the fire would have been controlled so that the bare minimum was left in the firebox at the end of the journey. Once over the disposal point, the smoke box would be cleaned first. This entailed opening the smoke box door, as previously mentioned. Depending on the locomotive type, this might need the assistance of the 3/4 inch spanner. Once the smoke box door was opened, the ash was emptied out from around the blast pipe with the firing shovel. It was always a good idea to test which way the wind was blowing before attempting this task. Once emptied, any spilt ash would then be brushed away from the area around the smoke box before tackling the cleaning of the fire. Depending on the type of locomotive, some of the later locomotives had rocking or drop grates. The fire would normally be cleaned in two halves. Any clean fire was first moved to one side of the firebox with a clinker shovel, and then the clinker, on the side to be cleaned first, would be broken up with the dart. The clinker would then be withdrawn through the firehole door, utilising the clinker shovel, before being thrown out the side of the locomotive via the footplate door. Once all the clinker had been removed from one side of the firebox, the clean fire would then be moved to the cleaned area of the grate, and the sequence would then be repeated on the other side of the firebox. The fire was kept up one side of the firebox and left like that until its next preparation. Finally, you would then open both the dampers, climb down into the pit, and brandishing an ashpan rake, these were usually left in the pit, go underneath the loco and rake out the ash from the ashpan. Here again, it depended on which way the wind was blowing to what end of the ashpan you faced. BR Standard and Bullied Pacific class locomotives fires were much easier to clean. The Standard class had rocking grates front and back, so the fire was pushed forward with the pricker first. The clinker then would be broken up with the dart before deploying the rocker bar to rock the fire bars back and forth to dispose of the clinker straight into the ashpan. Once the rear part of the firebox had been cleaned, the clean fire was pulled back under the firehole door with the pricker, and then the practice would be repeated to the front rocker grate. The rebuilt Bullied Pacific's firebox was of a similar principle, except the rocker grates were side by side, and a hopper had to be opened at the side of the ashpan first before rocking each side. As the rocker grate was activated, the clinker would fall through the opened hopper door onto the ground. The original Bully Pacific class had a drop grate in the middle of the firebox, and once opened by releasing a catch in the cab, the clinker would be broken up with a dart and manoeuvred through the opening with whatever firearm was best suitable. Incidentally, whilst disposing original Battle of Britain Class 34051 Winston Churchill at Salisbury, I opened the catch to release the drop grate, and the whole of the drop grate became detached and fell into the abyss. I'm now certain that driver Alan Ackhurst and I were the last footplate crew to have worked on this locomotive in steam, as it had been confirmed by James Lester, fireman of Sir Winston Churchill's funeral train, that upon inspection at Ropley, where the locomotive had been cosmetically restored for the Churchill's final journey exhibition at the National Rail Museum, York, the drop grate was still in the same position as where I left it. The next couple of photos shows the driver's cabin and the obligatory game of cards. Seen here from left to right are Gilbert Austin, Sid Ford, Alex McClymont and Ted Wells. Time to relax, and seen from left to right are Jeff Cook, Jim Emmings and Peter Bunce. Alex McClymont's blue towel is wrapped around the furnace's hot water pipe to dry. In this photograph, Jeff Cook and Alex McClymont try to boiler Paddy Kinsella. The object of the exercise was to try to place your opponent against the area of the boiler's hot water cylinder, the jacket of which had an area of uncovered white asbestos. This would then adhere to your black serge jacket, making it all white, hence the term being boilered. Health and safety issues clearly being ignored. With fire extinguishers at the ready, Bill Brain and Pat Kinsella act as firemen of a different kind outside the driver's cabin and ambulance room at Guildford. I was appointed as a fireman on the 9th of April 1962, and Mick Sparrow was appointed as a driver the same week, and we were booked together on the roster. The shifts revolved around 3 signing-on times, but at that time, because of government legislation, it was forbidden that any person under the age of 18 years of age should work between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. So I was only with Mick 2 weeks out of 3. One of these occasions was quite memorable, as it involved taking my push bike on the footplate between Woking and Guildford. We had a BR Standard Class 5MT locomotive, and as we were dashing through Warburton Station, running 10 to first at about 75 mile an hour, Mick said to me, "Climb aboard your bike and then you can claim that you've been through Warburton at 75 mile an hour on a push bike." This I duly performed, probably a record that still stands. After being with Mick for a few months, I was drafted into what was called the Old Man's Gang. This was made up of about a dozen drivers that were coming up for retirement, and the work consisted of mainly light goods parcels trains and shunting duties that didn't involve working in the London area, and also didn't involve any night work. The Golden Angel was being erected on the top of Guildford Cathedral at the time, and the saying was that they would only work in surrounding areas where they could still see the angel. Charlie Lyford was my first regular driver in this link, and he chain-smoked Craven A cigarettes. I said he smoked them, normally lit one up and they smouldered away in the wind. When Charlie retired, he was replaced by Reg Beer, and I spent several months with Reg before I moved up into the next link. We would also work freight trains from Guildford and Woking to Alton, sometimes going over to Borden, branching off on a single line at Bentley. At Borden, you would see other locomotives that belonged to the Longmoor Military Railway, which also had a connection to Lys. One of the turns we worked would also call in at Aldershot Government sidings. Entry and exit was via a ground frame between Aldershot and Aldershot South Junction, just before the bridge over the Basingstoke Canal. The main bulk of the train would be shunted up to the field stores, which was just over the other side of the main road, this being protected by a member of the shunting staff holding a red flag while the road was crossed. Other wagons would be shunted to the bakery, and also wagons of coke were shunted down to a siding that ran down near the canal, and special care was required as there was quite an incline to traverse. Once shunting had been completed and the train had been remarshalled, it was then customary for the guard, shunter and engine crew to make their way to the platelayer's hut to play a few hands of beanies, a card game similar to rummy, while having their lunch before setting off on the return journey to Guildford. Another memorable trip with Reg Beer was with a BR Standard Class 4 MT tank. After preparing the engine, water was taken on the new pit before running light to the carriage sidings at Guildford to pick up the empty coaching stock. The train was then worked bunker first to Dorking Town, where the train was run round, and this then made the passenger service to Reading. As we had some time before departure, I thought I'd check to see how much water we had used on the trip out from Guildford. I climbed onto the side tank, released the filler cap and looked inside, and to my amazement couldn't see any water in the tank. The worst thing I could have done was to inform Reg, who then went into panic mode, and because there wasn't a water column at Dorking, Reg decided to try to replenish the side tank with 5-gallon churns of water from the gents' toilet tap. Needless to say, by the time we'd filled the churn a number of times, it was decided that it would take forever, and the train would have to be cancelled. The ridiculous thing was that we still worked the empty coaching stock to Guildford and stopped at Shalford to use the water column there. The following day, I had to see the shedmaster, John Butt, to answer questions on whether I'd wasted water on the trip to Dorking by leaving the injector water valve open. I explained that this would have been very unlikely, as the water valves were positioned by the fireman's feet, and when sitting they made a comfortable footrest. To this day the mystery remains. Coal that we had delivered to our depot came in wagons, and these would be positioned in the coal road every day next to the 2 electric cranes. The coal would then be unloaded by hand into a skip, and this would be lifted by the crane and emptied into the tenders of the locomotives by releasing a lever on the front of the skip. Sometimes the coal would come from Yorkshire and would be of the hard black variety. This had amazing burning properties, but although it would burn fiercely and produce incredible heat, the downside would be that it burnt very quickly and would also produce lots of black smoke. On the other hand, some of the coal came from the Welsh valleys, and this would also burn extremely well, but not as fiercely as the Yorkshire coal. It would also swell up when burning and looked a bit like a cauliflower. Some of the other coal we had delivered was from the Kent collieries, such as Tilmanston and Betshanger, and some came in the form of briquettes, we called them eggs, and were made of coal dust held together with cement. Although they didn't form slabs of clinker, they did produce lots of ash, and the dust irritated your eyes. It was also difficult to keep them from rolling off the tender when on the move, especially at speed, when the tender would be oscillating backwards and forwards. However, one week we had a delivery of coal from Feltham that came from an old stack. It hardly had any lumps in it at all, and was littered with all sorts of junk, including bike wheels, wire and other bits of metal. My driver, Reg Beer, and I were fairly lucky that week, as the turn we were rostered was the Ascot Goods, an old man's gang turn. I heeded the warning, and upon preparation of the locomotive, a Q1 class, I spread a liberal amount of shingle over the fire bars before preparing the fire. This would normally avoid any clinker produced from the coal seeping into the fire bars, which in turn prevented primary air getting through to the fire. The turn involved running light to Woking Down Yard and working a mixed goods train to Ascot via Sturt Lane Junction. The junction was situated just beyond the Basingstoke Canal Aqueduct, between Purbright Junction and Farnborough, and this allowed you to branch round to Frimley Junction and then on to Camberley. As we left Woking Down Yard, the fire wouldn't liven up at all, and the steam pressure gauge needles gradually started to drop back. Luckily, we were held at signals at Sturt Lane Junction, which enabled us some respite. Whilst we were standing there, another train, the Woking to Basingstoke stopping service, came to a stand beside us on the down through line. Driver Frank Tickner and fireman Bill Brain being the crew. They were also suffering the same fate and were nearly down and out. Once our signal cleared, we just about made our way to Camberley and managed to set back inside the goods yard. The fire was in a right state by then, and Reg and I both looked around the yard to find anything that was combustible. Lumps of sleeper and even engine oil that we'd had on the loco was utilised to create heat. Eventually we set off and just managed to climb the steep bank up to Bagshot Tunnel. Luckily we didn't have to call in at Bagshot, so we were able to coast down through the station and up the short incline towards Ascot, reaching it safely without stopping. It was virtually impossible to clean the fire because, as expected, the clinker produced from the rubbish coal had melted between the fire bars, even though I'd used plenty of shingle when preparing the fire. Here again we were lucky enough to find some more pieces of sleeper to create enough flames to raise some more steam, and we were able to return with just a small goods train to Woking and then back light to Guildford. The train services were badly hit that day, and it wasn't long before another shipment of better quality coal was delivered to the coal stage at Guildford. My first introduction to becoming a motorcyclist was because of the Sharman twins, John and Alan. They both joined BR as engine cleaners in the summer of 1961 and both had motorcycles. They were already of an age to hold a licence. Alan owned a 350 AJS and John owned a Jawa. Alan asked me if I'd like to ride his AJS, and because I was under 16 at the time, I didn't have a licence. He suggested I ride it in the up-yard sidings between the lines of wagons. It was a tremendously exhilarating feeling riding such a powerful machine. I'd only ever ridden my dad's 50cc moped before. The adrenaline produced was something else, and I became completely hooked. I couldn't wait to own my own machine, and after I'd turned 17, I bought my first motorcycle, a second-hand 200cc James Captain. This was purchased from a firm called Minnier and Bruce. Their premises were roughly where Guildford Cinema Complex is now. Later, they transferred their business to the far end of Walnut Tree Close. After I passed my test in May 1963, other motorcycles followed. A 250cc Push, which had a split single-cylinder arrangement with 2 pistons, and this was followed by a 350cc Triumph 21. I can recall the first time that I parted company with a motorcycle. This was coming into work on an early turn. The A3 in those days had a completely different layout. You would cross the A3 at the end of Southway, join the southbound carriageway, and the only entrance to Guildford via the Chase was at the end of St John's Road. It had been raining that morning and the roads were slippery, and as I turned the corner into St John's Road, my bike went one way and I went the other, with me landing heavily in the road. I must admit, the incident taught me a valuable lesson in recognising road conditions and the dangers of bald tyres. My faithful Claude Butler cycle had now been relegated to the shed. This photograph, taken by the late Les Mills, shows a grand view from Yorkeys Bridge at Guildford Yard and Guildford Station in the early 1960s. A Drury 204 diesel shunter is seen shunting a cattle truck and mineral wagons in the downyard, and the signalman at Guildford Yard has to operate 27 levers to allow a train from one yard to the other. The wagon position in the middle siding contained Grant's and St James's wines and spirits, and for security reasons was kept there overnight until the goods shed opened in the morning. In the background, smoke from a locomotive is seen drifting from the motive power depot towards the station, and there's no evidence of the 2 blocks of flats that are there today. The first time that I encountered driver Stan Harms was when we were both booked together to work a special train to Red Hill and return to Reading. I'd heard about Stan's reputation that he didn't suffer fools gladly from various colleagues, and was a little apprehensive as we walked over to relieve the crew of the train, which had set out from Birkenhead, near Liverpool, to destinations on the south coast. At that time, I hadn't had much experience of working over the Red Hill line, and as the train approached the station, I wondered what I'd let myself in for. The train of 12 coaches was headed by a V schools class, and after we had climbed aboard, I could see by the state of the fire that we were in for a rough trip. We started away through the 2 tunnels to Shalford Junction, and as we climbed the steep bank from Shalford to Gomshall Lane, the pressure gauge steadily crept back. Despite my efforts to rouse the fire with the pricker, things weren't looking too good. Although we made it over the top of the bank, Stan didn't say a word but just stared ahead, and I could see that he wasn't too pleased with the way things were going. On reaching Red Hill, we ran light to the loco to turn the engine and take water, but time didn't allow me to clean the fire as we had to return to Reading within the next half hour. Thankfully, another locomotive was to double head us to Reading, and we set off with the schools class as a train engine and N class piloting. The fire by this time was in a terrible state, and although I was able to keep the pressure gauge from falling back too far, we weren't able to do much with the work and assisting the train up the steep bank from Dorking to Welcombe Bridge. We stopped at Guildford and the pilot locomotive took water, so whilst this was taking place, I was able to regain some steam and replenish the water in the boiler. A good job, as we still had to contend with the 1 in 100 climb out of Guildford to Pink's Hill. On reaching Reading, we ran light to Reading Southern Depot, and as we had some time to spare after turning the locomotive and taking water, I was able to clean most of the fire, and I make no exaggeration in saying that the clinker was nearly 2 feet thick in places. As I struggled with the long fire irons, manoeuvring the slabs of clinker through the firehole door, Stan understood that this was the cause of the problem. On our return journey, the locomotive was completely rejuvenated. I wish that I could say the same for myself, and the pressure gauge was on the mark all the way back to Guildford, where we got relieved by another Guildford crew. I think that Stan felt quite sorry for me and realised that I'd done my best that day with what was a difficult challenge, and that I wasn't one of those scenery firemen, one of Stan's favourite sayings, and a firm friendship was made between us. Neither of us knew at the time that we were to be booked together on a regular basis in the top link towards the end of steam. The first time that I'd worked an express passenger train on a main line as a fireman was on a Sunday when I was booked on a spare as ordered turn at Guildford. The running foreman came in and said that they needed a crew to go to passenger to Waterloo and work a special train to Southampton and get relief there. My driver was to be Ray Beeson, and he would be signing on later in the day at 3 p.m. Well, I'm not sure why Ray didn't turn up that day, but the job was given to past fireman Ted Lou Lewis, which I was quite pleased about. We caught the train to Waterloo and relieved the crew. The locomotive, rebuilt West Country Class 34026, Yes Tor, having been prepared but 9 elms, was already attached to the train. It was completely dark by the time we left, and although I'd worked on bullied Pacifics in the past, it had only been on light engine trips. However, as I remember, everything went according to plan. The locomotive steaming well in response to my firing technique, more luck than judgment, until we were checked for signals at Albrook on the approach to Eastleigh. Brian started to apply the vacuum brake, but found that he couldn't release it again, and we came to an abrupt halt. We were both puzzled at first and wondered if someone had pulled the communication cord in the train. I thought that I'd better check the vacuum hose connection on the front of the locomotive, and lo and behold, found that it had come off the dummy housing. I quickly connected the vacuum pipe and could only surmise that the securing pin hadn't been utilised when it had been used last, and it wasn't until the vacuum was destroyed that the pipe had sprung away from its dummy housing. We arrived at Southampton a few minutes late, but apart from that, it was a very memorable and enjoyable trip, and the first of many express non-stop trips to come. My next outing on the main line was with a 9 elms top link driver. I'd booked on at Guildford at 6 a.m. spare, and the running foreman came into the mess room and said that one of the 9 elms firemen had gone sick, and the only fireman available would only work the train from Waterloo as far as Woking. The turn would involve relieving the fireman at Woking, working through to Bournemouth, then after a break, working a fast express back to Waterloo and getting relief. I'd never seen the skies over what was beyond Southampton, and that had been in darkness, so this was going to be a baptism of fire, literally. Off I went, catching the train up to Woking, and I nervously waited for the train to arrive from Waterloo. The locomotive was a rebuilt West Country class. Unfortunately, I don't remember which one. The driver was a very pleasant character and welcomed me aboard. He asked me if I'd been to Bournemouth before, and when I said I hadn't, he said not to worry, and he'd let me know what was required. The fire hold door was open and the fire was virtually rolling out. The boiler was full and the pressure gauge was on the mark, which was a good testament to the fireman I'd relieved. Away we went, passing through Brookwood, where it wasn't long before I was standing on the station Trainspotting. Through Worthing Junction, and down through Micheldever, stopping at places I'd never even heard of before. On reaching Bournemouth, we were relieved by another crew, and we walked over to Bournemouth Depot and had a wash-up and made a can of tea, and before long it was time to walk over to the station and relieve another train that had just arrived. We climbed aboard a rebuilt Merchant Navy class locomotive, and my driver said that we'd be only stopping at Southampton and then run fast to Waterloo. Away we went from Bournemouth, the locomotive steaming freely, and it was an amazing feeling hurtling through the Hampshire countryside. We stopped at Southampton, and I was instructed by my driver to climb up onto the tender as we were going to take water there. After replenishing the tender, away we went towards Eastleigh, and I remember that I was firing virtually non-stop until we reached the top of the bank at Steventon. It was at this point my driver said to me, "All downhill now, lad. Sit down and blow your baccy." This I duly did for quite a number of miles, but when I next looked inside the firebox, there was hardly any fire there. I quickly started shoveling again, but my driver didn't seem to be worried and said that she'd be all right. My driver's predictions seemed to be true, and after passing Basingstoke and Woking and through the outer London area on time, we arrived at Waterloo without any problems. This photograph shows a fireman's view of the footplate of a rebuilt West Country class locomotive. The firebox grate area on these and Battle of Britain class locomotives was 38.25 square feet. The Merchant Navy class were 48.5 square feet, and on preparation, the fire was built up with huge lumps of coal placed into the back corners of the firebox. As the coal burnt through, the fire would be virtually rolling out the firehole door. Aldershot was a very busy place in the 1960s, and the up yard, situated beyond the country end of the station, was the most active when a lot of freight trains came and went at all times of the day and night. A long shunting neck was provided for fly shunting, and it progressed far beyond the high overbridge at Church Lane East, adjoining the road at Eggers Hill. A residential close now occupies the area. It wasn't long before I was trusted to perform the shunting duties, especially if the locomotive had a stiff reverser, and this was quite often carried out whilst the driver went to the shunter's cabin to read the newspaper or have a nap. Quite incredible when you think about it. I'd only left school 18 months previously, and here I was driving a steam locomotive on my own. Aldershot also had two signal boxes, a water column and turntable, which was quite often used if it was pouring down with rain and you were on the open tender locomotive without the storm sheet. There were two other yards, one situated at the London end of the station and the other on the downside of the country end of the station. The station was quite near to Aldershot Football Stadium, and when Aldershot Football Club were playing a home game, it was regular practice for railway staff to walk up to the embankment towards Aldershot Tunnel to watch the state of play for free. Farnham was also a busy place, and apart from goods traffic and large coal pens, there was a huge tip situated at the country end of the electric depot. Here we see a spoil train headed by BR Standard Class 5MT 73037, driven by Pat Kinsella, passing through Aldershot on its way to Farnham Tip. Finally, before I end my Firing Days Apprenticeship chapter, here's a wonderful piece of nostalgia that Richard Greenwood captured from Yorkeys Bridge, Guildford in July 1961. It shows a general view of Guildford's yards and station, with a steam haul passenger service leaving for Reading, a Guildford service arriving from Ascot, and a 350 horsepower diesel shunter in the upyard waiting for its next move. A light engine also awaits the signal on the departure road. Those were the days.